Hey. Hello and welcome to Sydney CocoaHeads for August 2020. This is our fifth online meetup. Still feels weird every time to be talking to my webcam. But no, welcome everybody. It's good to have you here. We've got a great talk lined up tonight. So let's get into it. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which CocoaHeads is usually held and would be held if it weren't for COVID. A little bit of housekeeping to begin with. So I'm Zach. I'm one of your hosts. Nikki is another host. He's not with us tonight. And we've also got Carl on the call. Hey, Carl.
Hi, everybody.
How you doing, Carl?
Not bad for a Thursday.
Oh, that's good. That's good. One more day. You can do it. As always, a big thank you to our sponsors, Billu, Academy, and Atlassian. They help with our costs and make CocoaHeads possible. So thanks, everyone. A reminder, as always, that Sydney CocoaHeads has a code of conduct. You can read it in full on our website, but it boils down to 3 key points. Be respectful, be inclusive, and be aware. The code of conduct applies to all CocoaHeads events. So that includes in-person, online, as well as our Slack community. And so if you feel like there's any issues with the code of conduct in any of those places, feel free to reach out to myself or Carl. And we'll be happy to address the concern. You can do that anonymously via email if you like as well. We've got email forms on our website. Now, because we're not in person, the best way to communicate throughout the night, throughout the talks, is on Slack. So we've got a Slack community. I'll leave this slide up there for a few seconds. If you want to take a screenshot of the URL, feel free to jump in the Slack, join in the discussion. We've got a dedicated meetup channel, which we've been using during the live events. But otherwise, even throughout the rest of the month, it's a good place to hang out. You can ask questions or anything like that in a community with fellow iOS developers. And of course, a reminder that that is subject to the code of conduct and everyone is welcome to join. So normally when we meet in person, I do a thing. I ask the first-time attendees to stand up and we give them a big clap and it'll make them feel welcome. Obviously, we can't do that, but if you are tuning in for the first time, welcome. It's great to have you here. And also a shout out to anyone who's non-Sydney based and is tuning in, because that's one of the cool things. Yay! Yeah, Carl's giving you claps. So you got claps from Carl. Hopefully, if you're in lockdown, if you're in Melbourne, hopefully we're able to keep you entertained for the night, have a bit of fun. You can forget about the situation for a while. That would be cool. Events. So again, normally I talk about upcoming events. We're a little bit limited on upcoming events, especially in-person events, but a couple of things to keep an eye on. The first is DevWorld. Normally, this is about the time of year I'd be saying, hey, make sure you get your tickets to DevWorld. It's happening at the end of next month. Oh, I think end of this month, normally end of August. We're still not exactly sure what's happening other than this tweet, but DevWorld is supposedly still going ahead at some point this year, online, of course. So stay tuned, I guess, to that Twitter account if you're interested in attending a remote conference. And the other thing that is well worth checking out is the Melbourne CocoaHeads group. They do their meetup every month, just like we do, on the second Thursday of the month, so a week before Sydney CocoaHeads. If you enjoy this meetup, definitely worth checking out the Melbourne CocoaHeads meetup as well, especially while it's happening online and everyone can join in at whatever time. Cool. So our schedule for tonight. Let's actually, okay, I stopped on the slides, but hiring and firing. So normally, if you're looking for work, or if you are know of a place that's hiring, feel free to jump into our Slack group, joining the jobs channel and post about it there. The Slack is probably the best place for this, as we can't meet in person. But yeah, feel free to post about any jobs there, or if you're looking, post there too. All right, so onto the schedule. We've got a few things happening tonight. So to begin with, the month in review. I'll quickly run us over what's been happening in the last 4 or 5, I think it's been 5 weeks since our last meetup. We have a talk on Swift UI by David Reedy. Got an interesting and new format for this talk tonight. David's actually pre-recorded his talk, a bit like Apple did for their WWDC videos. And we're going to be playing that back as a video tonight. So I think that's a really awesome way of getting the talk across. So I'm looking forward to that. And David will be, this frees David up during the talk to be around in the Slack group for questions. And I believe he'll also be on a Zoom call after the meetup as well, if you want to chat with him about the talk. Which brings me to the last item on the agenda, and that's our post-meetup Zoom catch-up. So the way this works is once David's talk is over and the meetup's officially over, I will post a Zoom URL in the Slack group. I ask you to keep this private. Please don't post this on Twitter. Generally, those things get scraped, like the links get scraped for Zoom calls. So try and keep it private, but everyone's welcome to join in that Zoom call. And yeah, so we'll just have a Zoom catch up after this. So everyone's welcome to join. All right. So as always, we're looking for talks. I think we've got one talk lined up for next month at this point, but it would be great to have another. A good way to get started talking at CocoaHeads is to give the month in review, just a few slides on what's been happening. There's no right or wrong things you can talk about there. That's another way is lightning talks. If you've been playing around with some fun new SwiftUI things or really anything that's fun and new from WWDC, these make great lightning talk topics. But otherwise, full-length talks, always welcome. Feel free to submit a talk via the link on screen. Otherwise, you can send myself or Carl a message. It can be on Twitter. It can be on via email, however it works. Yeah, any talk's welcome. If you want to workshop talk ideas as well, if you've got an idea or two and you're not quite sure how to turn it into a talk, I'm always happy to work through that with people as well. So just feel free to send me a message. You can fill in that form on the website, and I'll get back to you pretty quickly. So that's all the housekeeping out of the way. Let's get into the month in review. So we've been getting new betas. We're up to beta 5 of all the things. I had to change this slide about 20 minutes ago, actually, because I noticed that this morning we got a new macOS beta. We're up to beta 5 of Big Sur, but iOS 14 and Xcode 12 beta 5 are also out. We've been getting these at a pretty reliable 2-week cadence. Starting to get solid, it feels like now, where we're sort of approaching that release timeline. It's exciting. Being able to work in Xcode 12 most of every day is pretty good. It's a solid update, as is iOS 14. So I'm very much looking forward to these maturing even more over the next sort of month or so until we get closer to release. We got a 27-inch iMac update. This was cool, not an iMac, still good old Intel chipsets in here, next generation CPU, kind of exciting. All the faster, all the things like that. The Fusion drive is dead, so these are all SSD, which is really cool. This only applies to the 27-inch, but that's still really awesome because it was that Fusion drive was starting to feel a bit dated in the iMac. The other thing to note here with the iMac is that it got a 1080p front-facing webcam, which is awesome. I believe the iMac Pro has always had this, but the iMac itself hasn't. So sort of a nod to the current work-from-home situation where things like webcams are kind of important these days, as are quality microphones. So I really liked how it was called out in the press release for the iMac that it got the front-facing camera and how the need for that is greater today. So that's awesome, and hopefully that comes across more products. It'd be great to see the laptops have a 1080p camera or even an external monitor, because Apple don't really sell those anymore, other than that XDR, which is not really meant for most people, I don't think. Got some news on Phil Schiller advancing to Apple Fellow. So he's kind of stepping back from his head of senior vice president role of marketing. And Greg Joswiak is stepping up into that role. I believe Phil is still staying in charge of, I think it's live events and the App Store, but is taking more of a back step and sort of joins a few other Apple people, ex-Apple people Apple people who are still on their payroll, but maybe not working full-time roles. He's been at Apple, I believe, for 30-something years. So he's had a pretty impressive career, and probably deserves a bit of a break now. There was a bit of controversy this month over tech companies and antitrust. The big four CEOs were grilled in a court hearing in the United States over a lot of things around antitrust and monopoly, and do they play fair? Do they allow competitors to play fair? I'm not the best person to summarize this stuff. There's heaps of good things you can read and listen to online about what happened at the antitrust hearings. It was interesting. Probably not the type of thing you need to sit through, but there are plenty of good summaries. And as always, it's interesting to get little insights into these companies and the way their CEOs talk about them, as well as any tidbits that might pop up from the court documents and such. And it's also kind of rare for these CEOs to make public appearances, so it can be interesting. It can also be interesting to hear the politicians ask questions when they clearly don't know what they're talking about. This happens sometimes, so plenty of funny moments to come out of that. But also, obviously, it is interesting just the general topic of conversation around tech and antitrust and large companies and whatnot. More recently, and sort of continuing on the antitrust front, Apple has, Epic, one of the developers on the Apple platform, has had their app removed from the App Store for trying to circumvent the in-app subscription or in-app purchase payment method by offering their own, which, as we all know, is very much against the App Store rules. If you're selling digital goods, you must be taking a cut according to the App Store guidelines. Sorry, Apple must be taking a cut. We're using the in-app purchases, and they must be taking their 30%. So Epic, one of the larger developers, they develop a game called Fortnite, decided to break this rule, and then subsequently filed a lawsuit when they were pulled off the App Store. Now, this also happened on the Google Play Store because they did the same thing there, and they're trying to make the point that they should be allowed to offer their own payment method, and that Apple has a monopoly. They don't offer any other options for payment. It's quite interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. This has obviously been a topic of conversation for ages, but it seems like we've kind of reached a tipping point over the last couple of months. There was a situation a few months ago with an email app that didn't want to support subscriptions for their business model, and Apple wouldn't let them in the store because the app was useless without paying account. It was a whole thing. Anyway, I'm just quite fascinated to see where this whole thing goes and if it changes things going forward for the App Store and the platform we all develop for. So I've sort of boiled down the key complaints of both Epic but also other developers on the App Store, that sort of the things that this issue centers around. So the first one is that Apple's 30% cut is higher than what it should be for what they're offering, is the argument that's being put forth. Another one is that there's no option to provide alternative payment methods within the app. Some developers say the 30%, people think the 30% cut might be okay if there was an option to implement your own payment method. I know that would mean companies like Spotify and Netflix would then go back to offering the ability to sign up and pay within the app if they don't have to use the subscription system, which they've decided is too expensive at 30% for the first year and 15% for subsequent years. The other one, and this is a big one, and this has affected apps I've worked on too, and it's really quite frustrating to deal with app review over, is having limited to no ability to mention going to a website to accept a payment method. So if you've got a service and it does accept payment method in another form that isn't the App Store, you're not actually allowed to mention that in the app. The app is kind of just a dumb login screen with no mention of go to our website to sign up if it accepts payment from something else. And sometimes some reviewers will allow it, some don't. It's enforced very inconsistently. And then another big one is there's no alternative to distributing via the App Store. So that's a big antitrust complaint, is that, well, if we don't play by Apple's rules, we can't play at all. So yeah, there's a lot of tension. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes. Again, this is one of those things that's summarized far better elsewhere than I can do. But that's sort of where we're at with that issue. And as we all build apps for Apple's platforms, it kind of affects us or will affect us going forward. In other news, COVIDSafe is still a failure. There's been a few updates in the last month which make it a little bit better, but they're still refusing to adopt the Apple Google exposure notification framework, which is extremely disappointing and means that the app doesn't work as well as it could. So yeah, if you are interested in the COVIDSafe app and people uncovering what's going on there, Richard Nelson and Quentin Zavas are great people to follow on Twitter. They've been digging into the app, digging into the source code, which is all public, and just sort of documenting their findings. And it's really quite fascinating to follow, but it is a bit of a disaster. All right, I want to end on talking about what might be coming up over the next month. It's August now, so we're getting close to September, which is usually when we see announcements for shiny new Apple products. Always very exciting. Phones, watches, all the things. This was sort of the most reliable source I was able to find for rumored shipping dates. It's all still rumors at this point, but this guy at least believes to know that an Apple Watch and iPad will be announced via a press release in early September, and iPhone 12 and 12 Pros will be announced a month later in October, and then ship a few weeks after that. Quite exciting, getting to that exciting time of year. Personally, this doesn't make sense to me. I hope, I mean, I could be proven wrong, but I don't see them releasing a new Apple Watch a month ahead of the new iPhones if we assume that the release of iOS is going to be held off until the new iPhones ship. So then what we end up with watchOS 7 shipping a month before iOS 14. I don't really see that happening. Maybe all the software goes live in September and it's just the phones which come out later. Who knows? But it will definitely be interesting to see how they manage that. Seems like most companies at the moment are operating at least a month behind because of all the COVID stuff. So I guess Apple's not immune to that. We saw them push back WWDC. Tim Cook announced on an earnings call that the iPhone will come a few weeks later than normal. So we are expecting it. It's just a matter of when does the software ship at the same time. Personally, I'm hoping the software ships as late as possible because there's still so much work to do getting in iOS 14 updates for all the things. So even a few extra weeks there would be very, very helpful. All right, so it's time to get into David's talk on SwiftUI. As I mentioned, it is pre-recorded, so I'm just going to play a video. And if you have questions for David, he is in the Slack chat. Feel free to ask them as the talk goes. Otherwise, enjoy the presentation. Thanks, everyone.
G'day everyone. Before I begin, this presentation was developed and recorded on the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples. I acknowledge their custodianship of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So, SwiftUI. You might be wondering whether it's too soon to start considering adding SwiftUI to your arsenal of development approaches. Well, in the words of a political campaign that only a few of us are old enough to remember, when was the last time any political campaign had such a good sing-along? But yes, it's time. In this presentation, I'm going to look a little bit at the history behind SwiftUI and how that might help us make a decision whether or not to dive in. I'll quickly look at what appears to be Apple's thinking with the new language, and of course, that's all speculation. Then we'll have a look at what I'm doing in my latest app with SwiftUI to help improve the user experience, and that's where we'll start looking at some SwiftUI code. I'll finish up with a look at the pros and cons of adopting SwiftUI now, and then look at some of the online resources that are available to help you get started. Really, before we decide if we're going to implement SwiftUI at all, we need to know, is it important? Well, Apple is promoting it. Not that Apple haven't promoted things in the past that haven't quite worked out.
We think we have an idea of how to make this a better experience. And here it is. It's a mat that you place your iPhone 8 or iPhone 10 down, and it just starts to charge.
Let's hope they have more success this time. When it comes to languages, it does turn out they were pretty serious about Swift. As we've seen over the last few years at WWDC and in their publications, nearly all presentations now are only using Swift. And again, all the demonstration code that was put out for WWDC this year was also in Swift. So Apple have pretty much doubled down on that. The community has accepted it, and there's very little chance that Apple will be moving away from that anytime in the near future. So, are they just as serious about SwiftUI? Well, one of the big things that was discussed all the way through WWDC this year was having development that would work across all of Apple's platforms, from the TV to the watch to the iPhone and iPad and to Macs. SwiftUI, of course, is a big part in the standardization of the user interface coding. But most importantly, perhaps, we've seen that WidgetKit is a SwiftUI only package. Now, it's designed to work on almost everything. They're only making it available in SwiftUI, and it's unlikely that they would be building an entirely new feature on top of something they weren't really serious about keeping going over the long term. So let's assume it's fairly safe to believe that SwiftUI is going to be an ongoing big part of Apple's development. So how did we get to where we are? Well, in July of 2010, Chris Latner over at Apple started to work on what would become Swift. It was pretty much developed in secret until Apple announced it at WWDC in 2014. It sort of hit the public in September of that year with the release of iOS 8 and OS 10 Yosemite, which we have all been pronouncing incorrectly. Apparently, the correct way to pronounce it is...
When they gaze upon Yosemites,
A few brave souls started working on production applications, but Apple had issued a warning. Hidden in the documentation was a statement that they would not guarantee code compatibility between versions. And yes, they made good on that guarantee. Swift 1, 2014. Swift 2 comes out in 2015 at WWDC. There's been a large number of improvements to the language and a small number of incompatibilities with version 1, but with a tool it was fairly easy to move from 1 to 2. A year later, though, came version 3. Version 3 made significant changes to the language, and although they were universally hailed as improvements, it meant a lot of code that had already been written now broke. It also meant people had to learn a lot of new stuff. I mean, did it mean that early adopters, and I was one of them, had wasted the previous 2 years' worth of learning? No, but it was still a pain. You'd learned a lot, but, it got you a good start, but didn't get you all the way there. It would have been better if version 3 had been version 1, but, experience. Since version 3, the pace of change has been a lot slower. Swift was made open source in December 2015, and the evolution of the language has been guided through the community since then, although Apple is still very much involved in the mainstream development. We're now up to version 5.2 on release, and the latest betas of Xcode contain Swift 5.3. It would seem that the people at Apple involved with the development of Swift are pretty good at keeping secrets, as the next big step in Swift came as a surprise at WWDC 2019. In 2018, Apple had shown the first Mac apps that were ported from the iPad, and there had been much speculation the following year what Apple would reveal at the next WWDC. And as expected, Catalyst, as it became known, was announced during the keynote.
We spent the last year expanding the number of categories of apps the technology could support, and we've tuned it up so it results in a much better Mac app. And we're pleased to announce that we're making Catalyst available to developers today in macOS Catalina.
But it was Sherlocked less than 30 minutes later when Apple announced SwiftUI.
The true step function in development would only come when we engineered a new framework, built from the ground up to take advantage of everything that Swift had to offer. Today, we're announcing that new framework. It's called SwiftUI.
Apple has said that it's not going to merge the iOS and macOS systems. They grew up separated by a decade, and as a result, iOS was made very differently to the original app kit on macOS. In particular, the limitations of the iPhone's hardware made UIKit a very different platform to AppKit. That, of course, has now reversed, and the limitations are mostly gone, and UIKit is able to do some really powerful things that the older structure of AppKit makes difficult on the Mac. Apple could have chosen a winner and moved one platform over to the other, but the angst and disputes that would have caused in the developer community would have even overshadowed the correct pronunciation of GIF. SwiftUI came from combining the experience of both AppKit and UIKit with advances in programming techniques such as reactive programming, which had become popular in the intervening decade. But Is it a step forward or just a jump to the left? So let's have a look at an example of SwiftUI in practice. This is an application that I've been working on for a while now, and it's sort of ready for release. But as you know, software is never really finished. It's just released. And so I keep working on it, even though, it probably really doesn't need it. So UCare is an application designed to keep families up to date with what's happening with their relatives in aged or other forms of care. It's been designed to be used by the carers of a person rather than the person themselves, as quite often elderly people aren't comfortable using newer technologies. When I originally wrote UCare, it was written with a coordinator pattern for doing the user interface coordination. It worked quite nicely, as you'd have seen if you've been to some of my other talks. But after WWDC this year, I decided it was time to have a look at SwiftUI, so I forked the project to see if SwiftUI would be able to do the work we needed it to do, given the design constraints we've got with the program. The bit we're going to look at now is the meal report. The meal report's one of the more complex parts of the program and is basically designed to let people know what their relatives are being fed for breakfast, lunch and dinner, whether they enjoyed it and how much they ate. There are a number of restrictions in using it, one of them being that care workers tend to be fairly busy and often doing more than one thing at a time. One of the requirements is that any of the recordings of resident interactions need to be handled with one hand, because often your other hand is busy holding something or even holding the patient. Any information sent with the application obviously needs to be accurate. This information is keeping families informed about their loved ones, and so accuracy is, of course, very important. But most importantly for the user, it has to be quick and simple. As I said, care workers are very busy people, and if this takes any length of time, it's unlikely it would even get done. So, that said, let's have a look at the application. And just to note, all the data that's in the application is fictitious. It was made up from random numbers and lists of common names, so you're not going to be seeing any information that you shouldn't be. So this is the meal reporting screen. You start at the top by saying what sort of meal it is the person's having. So in this case, let's make it a snack. We want to add a photograph of the food, so we tap the button. The normal camera app comes up, take the photo. It means it gives you access to all of the camera features. Then down the bottom here, we can say that, Simone ate most of it. You'll notice up the top, the message that's being sent changes dynamically with moving the sliders. Sorry, I can't see my finger, but it's a limitation of the recording. Once we're sure it's right, we simply hit send now, and that's it. So how did we do that in SwiftUI? And remember that we have some constraints in using the software. For example, it still has to be one-handed. That bit where we tapped snack up the top normally is correctly filled in depending upon the time of day. Notice that the buttons are really big so that you can hit them from either side of the screen. And that the message up the top, which is the important information going to the families, is updated in real time. There's nothing you need to do to see what it's going to say. And then once you hit the button, basically everything happens automatically from there. So let's have a look at the code. So this is the code for the meal screen, basically. One of the first things you might notice is for all that functionality, it's not particularly long. The main part of the code is fewer than 100 lines. So firstly, SwiftUI is pretty compact. Now, one of the things you'll notice, though, is that there's an awful lot of stuff there. So to make some sense of it, let's do a little bit of collapsing. And then we'll come back and look at what these things are. So SwiftUI is entirely declarative. So basically what we're doing here is defining structs which explain how we would like the screen laid out rather than us explicitly saying exactly where everything needs to go. So you'll notice at the top there are a few things defined just like in normal Swift, but you may notice that there's an extra word in some of those variable declarations, and that's the @state keyword that's sitting at the front there. Basically, that means that SwiftUI is told to look at this variable and whenever it changes, then basically update the screen. So instead of having to write code to continually monitor what we're doing or what the user is doing so that we can update the screen to match, we have this way of putting a magic word in, and it will start looking after it for us. And we'll see that as we go through more of the code. So the idea of SwiftUI basically is everything is a view, and you can have views inside views and views next to views, and views inside views as far as down as you want to go. In this case, because I like to have the graphics nice, I use a Z stack. Now, a Z stack just means that each of the views that is inside a Z stack appears on top of each other. Z sort of being the depth of the screen. And as you put things in, these will basically layer on top of each other. So we want a Z stack so that I can put various things on that make up the entire UI, and they will appear one on top of the other. In this case, the most important thing actually is the color in the background is the reason I need the Z stack there. You'll notice down the bottom of the Z stack, we've got this dot notation. That's how we're adding properties to it. We set the title of the navigation bar, and then we put some code in for what should happen when this appears on the screen, sort of like the on view did load that we're all used to. We put a bit of padding in there just so it's not up against the edges. But notice we don't have to say very much more about that. SwiftUI is going to take into account the safe areas and all sorts of things that we don't need to worry about. You can still put code sort of to decide whether things should happen inside your code. So down there, we show the image view if we need to. Now, remember, we're using a Z stack, and the last thing we put in the Z stack will be the thing on top. So that if we need to show the capture image view, in other words, that's the camera, if it gets added to the stack as it does in the if clause, you can see there starting on line 75, then it will appear on top of everything else. I don't have to worry about hiding anything. It will appear there. And when it disappears, it will just leave whatever is behind it. So very, very simple way of adding some very nice functionality with basically one line of code. So let's have a look and see what's inside our Z stack. We'll open up this V stack. Now, a V stack is just like a Z stack, except everything's on the same level, vertically stacked from top to bottom. And you have an alignment property which lets you say whether you want them stacked to the left or stacked to the right, or leading and trailing, or stacked in the center. And I use the center because I sort of fill everything out. So let's see what's in there. So inside our V stack, we have another V stack. And that's because there's a couple of things that go up the top of the screen that I want to act as a group. So by making this V stack here have things inside it, these all work as their own little group, which is exactly what I needed to happen. So this V stack here has the picker in it. That's that list of meal names. As you can see, we're just pulling them out of the variable, an array variable that holds all the values. And it's a fairly simple way of putting it. You'll notice one of the new things, although it won't be new if you're used to PHP programming, is that this variable has a $, in front of it. Notice that matches up here with our state variable. And that's one of the ways we say, keep an eye on this thing. And if the meal name changes, then redo this part of the code. So, the selection, in this case, when you tap on it, the selection will change. That will change the value that's in meal name and update the screen and everything else. And you don't really need to worry about it. The next bit is the one line of code that does all of that report generation. Notice that throughout it, there are references back to the state variables. This time we're just using them, we're not changing them. So we don't need the $signs. And that whole thing is, again, put together in just one line of text, which is very nice. This line actually needs to be redone to take into account localization, but I haven't got around to doing that yet. That's one of those jobs that's coming up in the near future. But as we'll talk about localization a little bit, it's actually fairly simple to do. Spacer puts a space in. Notice I don't say how big it is. It just happens and it does it so it looks nice. If there is an image, it now adds that below this on the screen. And then down here, we've got a group. Now, a group, again, gives you the ability to run different parts of code depending upon what's happening. In this case, we show the photo button if there isn't a photo. There's a variable up the top that keeps track of whether or not a photo has been taken and whether it needs to be shown. So again, we can just put that in here and it will decide whether or not it needs to show the button or not. And again, very, very simply all coded in one spot. Pop a divider in so I've got a line. These are our sliders, a bit of text. The slider again linked back to that state variable. So whenever this changes, that state variable will change and that will cause the screen to be redrawn. So I'm not writing any code to make it do that. It does it all automatically. It's very nice. Similarly for the resident mood down here. So that's going to adjust that message at the top as the main thing that it is going to do. Then we have another VStack below all of that just to keep the buttons nicely arranged. You'll notice again that even with all the customization they've made to the buttons, that the button code itself is really, really simple. Basically, I have, and I'll show you in a moment, defined a thing called a wide button style. I just tell it what colors I want, and it does that. It puts the shadow in place and does all the other things. That button style gets used throughout the application. It means that if I want to change the style, of course, I go to one spot, change that, and it does it. And incidentally, putting shadows and rounded corners and everything is so much easier now using this because when it was designed so that you're able to do that fairly simply. And then we're back down to the bottom where we were before. Bit of padding to finish up with, and then a bit of code to show whether or not to show the camera on top of the whole thing. And let's have a look at what's in this on appear section. As I said, that's sort of like the view did load. So in this case, I use it to set up what's going to be going on the screen, setting up the calendar that's going to be used to work out basically which of those things at the top it should be doing. There are values in the settings that give the time periods for when breakfast, lunch, and dinner start and finish. And if it's not one of those, then it's a snack. So basically, that's the only thing that has to happen there is to just set up the initial state for when the view appears. All very, very straightforward. So basically, when you start with Swift UI, you're not learning Swift again. Basically, you're just learning how the user interface works, which of course is very different to the way it used to work in UIKit and in AppKit. This little bit down the bottom here is you don't need to worry too much about it. That's the part that gives you the preview functionality when working inside Xcode. I'm sure you've all seen that in demonstration, so I won't show it here, but basically it means that you can get a live preview of what's going on. And down here, you can start putting data in and dummy things so you can really get a good idea of what things look like while you're working on them without needing to run the code. So let's have a look at the code that makes up the wide button style that we saw in the earlier code. Basically, we're just defining a struct. In this case, we have two values that need to go into it. We have a background color and a foreground color. You saw that when we called it in our main code, that those are the two values we pop in. And then the main part of doing this is to implement the make body function. It's given a configuration that we can use, and it needs to return a view. I mean, this is Swift UI, everything's a view. You're able to get information about how the app is currently running. So here we find out whether the user interface style is dark, and if it is, then I change the color of the shadow. The shadow is darker against the dark background. In fact, basically it doesn't appear because it looks silly. So I just make it sort of the black background. Then all we need to do is return what goes inside the button. In this case, that's the label and then the things that affect that. We would like it to fill up the entire frame of the device. And so we can just set a maximum width of infinity, which, does that mean that Apple's got some really, really widescreen things planned? I'm not sure, but that's how you set to fill the whole thing. We want to bring it in from the side, so we add some padding to it. We say we would like it to be a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 10. The font should be headline. One of the nice things about that, of course, is because we're not specifying a font size directly, that things like accessibility that changes the text size will automatically be handled by our code. We don't need to worry about it. We set our foreground color, we set our background color. And in this case, this is how we pop a shadow in. And basically, I have an is pressed, so you get a slight animation. Again, I don't have to write the animation. I just have to set the two stages. That this is what it looks like when it's pressed, and this is what it looks like when it's not pressed. Basically, I just make it slightly smaller. The animation, everything is automatically handled. So you get that nice effect with, again, almost no coding at all, which is really nice. And that's really all there is to it. I've got a number of different button styles, but again, everything's just defined in the one place. So if in the long term we decide that buttons should look different, we just make changes here. The one thing you do need to be careful about, and it took me a while, is the order of these things is important. You get them around the wrong way and all sorts of weird things happen. So I knew what I wanted, but it was a fair bit of experimentation to get these into the right order the first time through. Because once you've done it the first time, it's right for all the other ones. But yes, you do need to be a little bit careful, and there's not a lot of documentation on that. So, but trial and error is very simple with this, because you can have previews and things running if you need to. But yes, it's a bit frustrating till you realize what the problem is. But I do think it's an improvement on the old way of doing things. So if we're thinking of moving to SwiftUI, we really need to look at the pros and cons. So what are some of the pros? Well, as we've seen, SwiftUI is event-driven, so it fits with modern programming quite well. It also means that we can do really simple dynamic interfaces. It is now much, much simpler to do nice animations and very responsive systems with a lot less coding than was previously necessary. So if you want that sort of interface, then yes, it's a good idea to start looking seriously at SwiftUI. And of course, it's cross-platform. At least it's cross-platform within the Apple ecosystem, which means that if you're developing on your iPhone, your iPad, you're halfway there for the Mac and the watch and other things. I wouldn't say it's sort of all automatic at this stage, but it's certainly not double the work to move, say, an iOS application over to the Mac. In terms of the coding, localization is much simpler. You might have noticed that nowhere in the code that we looked at before did you see NS localized string. It's pretty much gone. All of the standard Swift controls support localization. So when you go to export an XLIF file, it looks in those and gets the information out automatically. None of this, you have to mark things to be localized. Basically, they're now localized by default. I suppose you can ignore it if you want to. There's still a few things where you do have to mark them up with NS localized string, but there's very, very few of them. And if you're pretty much sticking to the standard controls and not doing too much string manipulation, you may never have to worry about it again. Another big plus, of course, is accessibility. As in the past, most of the controls have the accessibility built in. If you use them, then you'll get things like voiceovers supported. You'll get differing text sizes supported as well. And especially because of the declarative nature of the layout, your layouts work much better with varying text sizes and word lengths and things like that. So you sort of get a lot of that for free. You still need to test it, and occasionally it can end up looking pretty awful. But as a starting point, certainly SwiftUI makes it much easier to get things going, to make your apps more accessible to people with low or no vision. Of course, along with the good things come the bad things. So there are some cons. And the big one at the moment is still there is a lack of documentation. It can be quite hard to find exactly what it is you're looking for. Although Apple are getting much better at this, and certainly the resources that came out after this year's WWDC have been much better than they have been in the past. But there's still a long way to go, and you can expect to spend some of your time doing a lot of Googling and Stack Overflowing and looking outside the official documentation to find out what's going on. And of course, not quite all of the tools are working properly yet. I like to use SwiftLint to keep everything nice, and I write code that's reasonably clean. The SwiftUI code, I've been following the styles that you see commonly on the internet. But if you turn the linter on, the code you saw earlier had the linter turned off. If you turn it on, I'll show you what happens. So here we are back at the meal record view code. If we look at issues at the moment, there aren't any, but let's try turning the linter on. And now let's see what happens. Well, we've gone from having no issues to 137 of them. And as you can see, looking down here, most of them are just because SwiftUI is laid out differently to normal Swift. So at the moment, it is probably much better to work without the linter on than with the linter on. Hopefully, they're going to fix that in the near future. Another problem is that the compiler in Xcode is not quite up to the job of giving you decent error messages. Now, apparently, remember I didn't start SwiftUI until this year. Apparently, this used to be really, really bad. Now it's just moderately bad. Occasionally, you'll get error messages in the compiler that are of absolutely no help at all. And you have to resort to going back to, Command Zing until the error disappears, and then stepping slowly forward, adding a line at a time until you find out what it was that you did wrong because the compiler didn't point at it particularly well. I'll show you an example of that too. Here's the meal record code from before. I have deliberately, yes, really it's deliberately, introduced an error into the code. As you can see in the sidebar, we're being told there's an error. It's telling us an error. If we go down, it will tell us that it expected a closing brace in the struct. Doesn't actually tell us where, however. Somewhere in amongst all this code, there is a missing closing brace. I only know where it is because I took it out and I left the line marked. It would be nice if it would give us a little bit more information about what's going on. There are even other ones. For example, you will occasionally, if I take this out here, you'll get errors up the top that failed to produce a diagnostic for the expression, please file a bug report, turns up all the time. In this case, it's showing us where the error is. In other cases, though, it doesn't. So if you're going to get into SwiftUI, you're going to need some resources. Let's have a look at some of the ones that are available. These are just three that I've been using a fair bit. Of course, first up, there's Apple's documentation, which, as I said before, is still lacking a bit, but is much, much better than it has been in the past. Combine that, of course, with the videos from WWDC for both last year and this year, and there's a fair bit of stuff there. It can be at times difficult to find exactly what you want, but they're not too bad. But it's certainly a worthwhile place to know your way around, as there's lots of information there. Secondly, there's Paul Hudson's site. Now, Paul has two sites. Hacking with Swift is his free one, and Hacking with Swift Plus is his paid one. In both cases, there are lots of articles on Swift and lots of articles on SwiftUI. He also has a free course called 100 Days of SwiftUI, which will take you from basically knowing absolutely nothing to being fairly good with it towards the end. And of course, this year it's built on top of that again. So it'll get you started with the beginning stuff, and then he's got new things coming out all the time, although he's just been on holidays. Lastly, if you want a podcast to listen to, I like to listen to Stack Trace. It's John Sundell, you would know from all the stuff he does for WWDC as a third party, and Guy Rambo, Apple's nemesis, who finds lots of things in their website. They're both programmers, and they're doing not quite run-of-the-mill stuff, so there's always interesting things in there. A lot of it is Swift, and occasionally SwiftUI as well. So those are just three. There are lots and lots of other things on the internet, and of course there's Stack Overflow for when you really get stuck. Thanks very much for your attention. If you would like to contact me, my email address is david@utea.ch. You can find me on Twitter at ReDD, And if you want to check out the website attached to the software we looked at, it's at www.ucare. That's uca.re. Thanks very much. See you soon.
Cool. Thanks heaps for that, David. Obviously not on the call, so I can't thank you personally, but David is around in the Slack and in the YouTube comments. He's been quite active answering questions during that presentation. So if you want to have a chat with David or ask any questions, feel free to jump into Slack and do that. So that about wraps up CocoaHeads for this evening. We will be moving to a Zoom chat if anyone wants to join in and have a catch up with some fellow CocoaHeads people. I'll be posting the link to that Zoom call in the Slack group as soon as this live stream ends. So feel free to join. As a reminder, we are looking for talks for next month. If you're interested, feel free to send myself or Carl a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Otherwise, thank you for attending. Hope you enjoyed the talk and we'll catch you all in September. Have a good month, everyone, and stay safe.